He paid a stranger's debt in river-worn gold and took her north into the boreal dark, and she had no idea the silent trapper had kept her memory burning for 11 years. The autumn of 1887 arrived in the Lac-Saint-Jean country of Quebec the way bad news always does, quietly and all at once. The maples along the Rivière aux Sables had barely begun to turn when the frost came early, blackening the potato fields overnight and sealing the fate of every family who had gambled on a late harvest. For Renaud and Celeste Moreau, that frost was the last note in a long, crushing song of debt. Their farm, a modest clearing carved from the boreal edge 12 kilometers north of Roberval, had been failing for 3 years. The sawmill that had promised steady work had closed. The cow had gone dry, the roof leaked over the children's beds, and Renaud had plugged the gaps with river clay that crumbled every spring. What the frost didn't ruin, Laurent Favreau would come to collect. Favreau was the kind of man who dressed like a deacon and thought like a vulture. He operated a lending house out of Roberval and held notes on half the farms between the lake and the tree line. On a gray Wednesday morning in late October, he arrived at the Moreau yard in a rented buggy, 2 thick-necked men riding behind him on muddy horses. He wore a black wool coat with a fur collar that hadn't come from any animal trapped in this province, and his boots were city boots, unblemished by honest work. Inside the farmhouse, Annette Moreau stood at the kitchen window, watching him step down from the buggy. She was 22 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had been dreading this visit since the first frost killed the potatoes. Her younger brother, 8-year-old Theo, sat behind her on the floor, building a small tower from river stones, unaware. Her mother was in bed with a lung cough that had been worsening since September. Through the glass, Annette watched Favreau straighten his coat and look toward the house with the calm, patient expression of a man who knows he has already won. Her father met him in the yard. Renaud Moreau was a large man, broad through the shoulders, but hard seasons had worn the certainty out of him. He held his wool cap in both hands, the way men hold something when they have nothing left to offer. Favreau's voice carried through the warped window frame, the notes, the interest, the arrears, the figure he named, $240, made Annette press her forehead against the cold glass. Her father's reply was broken. Spring planting. A buyer in Chicoutimi. Just the winter to get through. Favreau shook his head with the slow, theatrical regret of a man who had rehearsed the gesture. He looked again toward the farmhouse window, and his eyes settled there for a moment too long. Then he spoke words that turned Annette's blood cold. He needed a housekeeper for his establishment in Roberval, a capable young woman. A 1-year contract would settle the debt in full. He said it with the careful language of a man who understood exactly what he was offering and exactly what it meant. Renaud staggered back as if the ground had shifted under him. From the bedroom, Celeste's cough broke through the silence. Before her father could answer, before Annette could think, the sound of heavy hooves cut through the yard. Slow, deliberate, each step placed with the unhurried certainty of a man who is never in a hurry because he has nothing to fear. The horse was a dark gray Percheron, enormous and calm, its coat still thick with the muskeg country to the north. The man on its back was difficult to measure against ordinary men. He wore a long canvas coat rubbed dark with pine pitch and linseed oil, a wool blanket wrapped over one shoulder against the cold, and a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low. His face, what could be seen of it beneath the hat, was hard and weathered, somewhere north of 35. A long, faded scar traced the line of his jaw from ear to chin. Not a knife scar, something broader, older. His hands on the reins were the color of tanned leather and twice the usual size. Across his saddle rested a .45-70 government rifle, the blued metal worn silver at the action from years of handling. He was known in the Lac-Saint-Jean country by reputation more than by sight. Most people had never actually seen him. His name was Silas Greer, and he came down from the northern bush country, the boreal tangle between the upper Parabanca River and the height of land, twice a year to trade furs at the post in Roberval. He spoke French well enough and English better. He had no family that anyone could name. He had a cabin somewhere north that no one had ever found, and he seemed to require very little from the world below the tree line. Silas pulled the Percheron to a halt between Favreau's men and Renaud Moreau. The two riders instinctively straightened in their saddles. The horse didn't flinch. Silas didn't look at Favreau. He looked at Renaud. Then his gaze shifted briefly to the farmhouse window, to where Annette stood behind the glass. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, the color of lake ice in March. They found hers for the space of a single breath. She didn't know what she saw in them. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't cruelty, it was something heavier. Recognition, maybe, though that made no sense at all. "I heard the terms," Silas said. His voice came from somewhere low and quiet, the kind of voice that carries in open country without needing to be raised. Favreau turned in the saddle, visibly irritated. "This is private business, trapper. Move along." Silas reached inside his coat. He withdrew a canvas bag, the neck tied with a rawhide lace, and held it out. Not offered, extended with finality, the way a man places a stone that isn't moving. $260 in gold, he said. Panned from the Parabanca tributaries over 3 seasons. Weigh it if you want. One of Favreau's men dismounted, loosened the lace, looked inside. He glanced at his employer and gave a short, reluctant nod. "The debt is paid," Silas said. "The girl's contract is mine." Inside the farmhouse, the floor swam beneath Annette's feet. Her father dropped to one knee in the mud. Her mother's cough came again from the bedroom. Favreau's face worked through several expressions before settling on cold fury. He was a man who dealt in desperation, and this trapper had just bought it out from under him. He stared at the gold for a long moment. Then he snapped his reins, jerked his buggy around, and left, without a word, his men following behind. Silas dismounted. His boots hit the ground heavily. He walked to the farmhouse door and pushed it open without knocking, filling the frame completely. Annette had backed to the stone hearth. She had her arms crossed, not from cold, and her jaw was set hard. "I'm not livestock," she said. "No," Silas agreed, without a pause, without apology. "You're not. But Favreau would have treated you as such." He looked at her steadily. "I have a cabin on the upper Parabanca 4 days north. I need someone to tend the place through winter while my leg finishes healing." He gestured briefly toward his left side, where his coat hung slightly wrong. "I'm not asking for anything that isn't fair. You'll be clothed, fed, and warm. You'll be returned in the spring if you want to go. And if I don't want to go north at all, then Favreau comes back and your father loses the farm. Those are the real choices. I didn't make them." He wasn't cruel about it. He was simply honest in the brutal way of people who live where dishonesty is a liability. Annette looked at her father kneeling in the yard. She looked at the ceiling above her mother's bed. She thought of what Favreau's eyes had looked like when they settled on the farmhouse window. She went to her room and packed a canvas bag, her mother's rosary, a wool dress, the battered copy of Les Miserables she had read until the spine cracked. She came back out in 10 minutes. Silas had waited without moving. They rode north. The first 2 days were silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers who have nothing to say, but the harder silence of people measuring each other. Annette rode a bay mare that Silas led on a long tether, freeing her from navigational obligation, but not from him. The trails north of Roberval dissolved quickly into logging tracks and then into something less than tracks, a memory of passage through black spruce and tamarack, across frozen creek beds, and through stands of white birch that flashed in the low autumn light like struck matches. Silas moved through this landscape with the total ease of a man who has no use for landmarks because the land itself is the map. He noted things she couldn't see. A change in the way the wind moved through the upper branches, a track pressed into creek ice, the direction a raven had flown 20 minutes earlier. He said nothing about any of it. He just adjusted course the way water does. Annette watched him when he couldn't see her watching, the scar along his jaw. The way his left leg settled differently in the stirrup. There was damage there, something old. The fact that he had paid $260 for a debt of $240 and had not mentioned the extra 20. On the third evening, camped under a granite overhang while the temperature plunged to something serious, the cold found the gaps in Annette's traveling coat, and she began to shake, not dramatically, but persistently, in that deep muscular way that doesn't stop on its own. Silas was on the other side of the fire, sharpening a draw knife. He looked up, he set the tool down. Without a word, he crossed to the pack horse, unrolled something from behind the saddle, and brought it to her. It was a Hudson's Bay 4-point blanket, the heavy wool kind, cream with green and red bands. He dropped it around her shoulders the way you cover someone who is cold and not someone you intend to impress. "Eat more," he said. "Cold burns more fuel than people expect." He went back to his side of the fire. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. Her teeth had stopped chattering enough to make speech possible. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. 11 years? Alone? Mostly. She watched the fire. That's a long time to be mostly alone. He turned the draw knife over in his hand. Longer for some than others. On the fourth afternoon they crested a low granite ridge, and the land opened below them into a hidden river valley, the Peribonka running steel gray between its banks, not yet frozen solid, the current showing dark and fast through the shelf ice at the edges. The spruce forest on both sides was old growth, enormous trees close together, the kind of forest that absorbs sound and returns silence. And there, in a clearing against the east-facing slope where the morning sun would find it first, was the cabin. It was nothing like what Annette had imagined. The logs were hand-squared, fitted tight with moss chinking that had been replaced recently. The roof was living sod, greened over in summer and now frost-gray, thick enough to insulate against any cold the north could manufacture. A woodshed ran the length of the south wall, already stacked 4 feet deep with split birch and spruce. There was a root cellar, a small smokehouse, a lean-to for the horses. Everything was built close, deliberately, the way animals arrange themselves for warmth. Inside the cabin was one large room kept with a military precision that surprised her. Cast iron pots hung in order of size. Tools were racked by type. A work table ran the length of the north wall, and above it, on wooden pegs, hung the working parts of the trapper's year. Hide scrapers, trap springs, wedges, rolls of snare wire. The floor was puncheon, split logs laid flat and swept clean. In the center of the room stood a large Quebec hearth, stone-built, radiating heat from a slow birch fire. Against the far wall, a single wide bed, carefully made, a wool blanket folded at the foot. Annette stood in the center of the room, holding her bag, and calculated her situation with the clear-eyed practicality of a farmer's daughter who has never had the luxury of panic. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. Silas nodded toward a rope cot near the hearth, already set with a folded moose hide. "I'll take the cot," Annette said. "The bed's better built. You take it. You're the one with a bad leg." A pause. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite an expression. "I'll manage." He turned, pulled on his coat, and picked up the empty water buckets. "There's dried fish in the larder, hardtack on the shelf. I'll be back before dark." He went out. Annette set her bag on the work table. She looked around the room carefully, the way you look at a place you may be in for longer than planned. And then her eyes stopped. Above the fireplace, on the wide stone mantel, between a tin of sulfur matches and a coil of extra wicking, sat a small carved object. She crossed the room and picked it up. It was a bird, a Canada jay, carved in pale birch wood with a care that seemed entirely out of keeping with the practical severity of everything else in this cabin. The wings were spread, the head tilted. The carving was worn smooth on the breast, and along one wing, the smoothness of something handled regularly over many years. Not decoration, but something kept close, something returned to. A sound moved through Annette like cold water. She was 10 years old. The Chicoutimi Fair, midsummer, 1877. She had wandered from her parents and gotten turned around in the crowd near the river landing, and the crowd surged, and she went in. Not deep. The Saguenay was low that August, but the current grabbed her feet on the slick rock and took her down hard, and she swallowed water and couldn't find the bottom and couldn't find the air. And then there were hands, large hands, sure and calm, that caught her under the arms and hauled her to the bank as if she weighed nothing. She sat on the river rock, coughing, while the world sorted itself back into the right order. The boy crouched beside her. He was maybe 14 or 15, raw-boned and serious, with pale gray eyes that looked older than his face. He didn't make a fuss of it. He waited until she stopped shaking. Then he reached into his coat pocket, took out a small carved bird, a Canada jay, its wings spread, and pressed it into her hand. "Keep it," he had said, in the French of someone who had learned it carefully. "Gives you something to hold when things go sideways." She had kept it for 2 years. She had lost it in the fire that took their first barn, the summer of 1879. She had mourned it the way you mourn small things that meant more than you understood at the time. Annette stood in the cabin on the upper Parabonka, with the carved jay trembling in her hand, and her breath coming in short, useless increments. She heard the door. When Silas came back in with the water buckets, the cold rushing in with him, she was standing at the hearth. Her arm was extended. Her palm was open. The carved bird sat in the center of it. He stopped as completely as a man can stop. The buckets were still in his hands. The water inside them made small sounds and went quiet. "The Chicoutimi Fair," Annette said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "The summer of 1877, the river landing." Silas set the buckets down on the floor very carefully, as if ordinary actions required more attention than they usually did. He pulled off his hat. Without the brim shadowing his face, she could see him more clearly than she had managed to yet. The pale gray eyes, the bones of his face, the faded scar along the jaw that hadn't been there when he was 15. "You were in the water," he said. "Not a question. You pulled me out." He was quiet for a long time. The birch fire popped. Outside, the river moved over its stones in the dark. "I left Chicoutimi 3 weeks after that," he said finally. He moved to the hearth, crouching to add a split log, buying his hands something to do. "My father had debts of his own. We moved north for work, the Paribonka logging camps. He died the second winter, took sick and didn't come back from it. I stayed 11 years, Annette said. I came through Roberval each spring and autumn, traded furs. The year before last, I saw you outside the dry goods. I didn't approach." He paused. "I didn't know how." Annette looked at the carved bird in her hand. Then she looked at this man, this silent, enormous, scarred man who had spent 11 years in the northern bush and apparently carried her memory with him the whole time, who had given away 3 seasons of panned gold to keep Favreau's hands off her. "You could have just introduced yourself," she said. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was what a smile looks like in a man who hasn't had much occasion for them. "I could have," he allowed. That night changed the temperature of things inside the cabin, not immediately, not dramatically, but in the way that cold country changes. Gradually, with the slow, irrefutable logic of the seasons. Annette took the cot. Silas took the moose hide by the fire. Neither of them mentioned the carved bird again. But she kept it on the mantel, and he seemed to notice that she had. The northern winter arrived 10 days after Annette did, and it arrived absolutely. Snow buried the root cellar door to the lintel, and the Parabonka locked solid, the ice groaning at night as it thickened, a sound like the earth settling its bones. The temperature fell to places the thermometer struggled to describe. The spruce trees exploded in the night with gunshot cracks as the cold split their heartwood. In this enclosed, frozen world, they made a life out of the available materials. Silas taught her to read the trapline. 16 kilometers of it, following the river tributaries north and east, set for beaver, marten, and fisher. She learned to reset a trap spring without losing a finger, to skin cleanly along the seam lines, dress stretch a hide on the frame at the correct tension. He was a careful teacher, economical with words but generous with repetition, willing to demonstrate the same thing 4 times without impatience if 4 times was what was needed. She taught him things he hadn't known he was missing. She read aloud in the evenings, Victor Hugo's long sentences filling the cabin and being absorbed by the log walls. She baked bread from their flour stock, the smell of it doing something to the severity of the space that she hadn't anticipated. She asked him questions, not intrusive ones, but small questions about the world north of them, where the caribou went in deep winter, what the upper Parabanca looked like in May, whether he had ever seen the northern lights so close they made a sound. He answered all of them. He began to talk more. Not much, but more. In the deep cold of January, disaster came from the direction they hadn't watched. It was a Wednesday evening, moonless, 50 below. Annette was mending a sum in Silas' canvas coat when the sound arrived. Ice on the river giving way in a manner too sudden and too focused to be natural. Followed by the creak and groan of the dock, Silas had cut into the bank for summer canoe access. Men on the ice, Silas was at the rifle peg before she processed the thought. He loaded the 45-70 in the dark by touch alone, the brass cartridge clicking home. He looked at her. "The back window," he said. "Small. They won't watch it. If it goes wrong, go north into the trees and don't come back until you hear me call. You'll know my call." He had a particular whistle, 3 notes, the pattern of a white-throated sparrow, that he used to signal the horses. "I know your call," she said. He went out through the front. She went to the back window and unlatched it silently. There were 4 of them. In the moonless dark she couldn't see faces, but she could hear voices carrying flat and cold over the frozen river. Roberval accents. Favreau's men, or hired men working for Favreau's interest. Laurent Favreau, it turned out, was not a man who accepted the legal redemption of a debt as the end of the conversation. He had waited 3 months and sent men north with a simple instruction. Find the Moreau girl. Bring the trapper's gold. Burn what's left. From the back window, Annette heard Silas's voice come out of the darkness north of the cabin, calm and carrying. 4 men on ice in the dark in January, he said. That's 3 different ways to die before you reach the porch. A voice she didn't know. Give us the gold and the girl, and we walk away. The gold's spoken for, Silas said. And the girl isn't property. Walk away from this yourself while the option exists. A pause. Then the sound of a rifle being worked. Annette didn't wait. She had spent 3 months on the trapline. She had learned what the .45-70 could do at distance, and what the smaller Remington rolling block. The rifle Silas kept at the back window for exactly this kind of emergency. She understood now, was for up close. She lifted it from its pegs. She checked the load the same way she checked everything now, with her hands, not her eyes. Then she came around the south side of the cabin into the dark. They hadn't watched the south side. She couldn't take 4 men. But Silas was somewhere north in the trees, and these 4 were between her and him, and one of them had just worked a rifle action. She picked the man closest to the cabin door, the one who would reach it first, and she aimed the way Silas had taught her. Not at the mass of the man, at the specific intention of the man. Breathe out. Let the decision happen before the trigger does. She fired. The noise in the stillness of that winter night was enormous. The man went down clutching his knee. The other 3 broke in different directions, which was the right instinct and the wrong application of it, because Silas had been in the tree line for 2 minutes already, and he was, above all things, a man who understood terrain. 2 rifle shots echoed from the north, disciplined and spaced. A 3rd man went down. The 4th threw his weapon onto the ice and put his hands up. The one she had shot was lying still, alive but not moving. In the ringing silence that followed, the white-throated sparrow call came from the tree line. 3 notes, clean and clear. Annette let her breath out. They bound the 2 survivors, packed their wounds with clean snow and strips of canvas, and left them in the woodshed with enough food to survive the night. In the morning, Silas put them on their horses with a message for Favreau, delivered in the direct language of the North Country where embellishment is considered a waste of warmth. The message was, "It ends here." Favreau, to the surprise of no one who understood arithmetic, sent no one else. But Silas understood that a man like Favreau operated on leverage, and leverage had a way of finding new shapes. 2 weeks after the attack, he came inside from the evening trapping circuit with the expression of a man who has been deciding something for a long time and has finally decided it. "Sit down," he said. Annette sat down. He stood at the work table with his hat in his hands, which was the closest thing to visible discomfort she had ever seen in him. "There's a land office in Quebec City," he said, "and there's a judge in Chicoutimi who owes me a debt of a different kind. I pulled him out of a bad situation on the river 3 years ago, and he's an honest man who remembers it." He set his hat on the table. "If you want the farm legal, clear of Favreau's claims, and in your name alone, I can make that happen. Your father's notes can be voided if the original lending terms violated provincial statute, and there's a good case they did." Annette looked at him. "You've been working this out since November." "Why?" He looked at his hands on the table. "Because you should have something that's yours, not his, not your father's, not mine." He looked up. "Because that's what I was trying to give you when I paid the debt. Not a contract. An exit." The fire cracked. Outside, the river ice said nothing. "Silas," Annette said carefully, "the farm is half a day's ride from where I'm sitting. We're 4 days north of Roberval. It's February." She paused. "I know exactly where I am." He was very still. "I'm not asking to leave," she said. He sat down across the table from her, not close, but closer than he usually sat. "Spring will change things," he said. It wasn't a warning. It was more like a question. "Spring always changes things," she agreed. "That's different from changing what matters. The Quebec winter does not release its grip quickly or with grace. It lets go the way old grief does. In stages, in betrayals, a warm week followed by a hard freeze. The ice rotten on the river before the banks are clear, but it does eventually let go." By late April, the Peribonka was running open and brown with snowmelt. The sod roof over the cabin dripped steadily for a week, and then the dripping stopped, and the first green appeared at the edges of the clearing, sharp and exact as a line drawn in new ink. Annette stood on the south-facing slope above the cabin one morning and looked at the country spread below her. The river, the forest canopy going soft green at the edges, the smoke from the cabin chimney moving straight up in the still morning air. She had grown into this landscape in a way she hadn't seen coming, the way you grow into anything true, not by deciding to, but by finding yourself already there. She heard Silas come up behind her. He moved quietly, as he always did, but she had learned the particular weight of his footfall on this ground, and she no longer startled. He stood beside her and looked what she was looking at. "Your father sent a letter," he said. "Came with the supply canoe from Roberval. The judge in Chicoutimi ruled the original notes fraudulent. Favreau's claims on the farm are void." He paused. "The deed's in your mother's name now, her idea, apparently." Annette smiled. Of course it was her mother's idea. "She also says," Silas continued, in the careful tone of a man reading from memory, "that you are welcome home whenever you choose, and that if you don't choose to come, she would like to know that you are all right." Annette was quiet for a moment. Then, "Write back and tell her I'm all right. Tell her I'll visit when the river settles." She looked at the smoke rising from the cabin chimney. "Tell her I've found something worth staying for." Silas said nothing, but she felt him settle, some long-held tension releasing across his shoulders, the way the land itself releases when the ice finally goes and the water can move again. He reached into his shirt pocket and held something out. It was the carved Canada J. She had left it on the mantel. He had brought it up the hill. "You keep leaving this behind," he said. "You keep bringing it back," she answered. She took it from his hand. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange. Just a moment. Just the ordinary warmth of two people standing close on a spring hillside, and neither of them moved away from it. Down on the river, a canoe moved in the current, the first paddler of the season making for the lake, small and purposeful, in all that open water. Annette closed her hand around the carved bird, pressed it against her palm, and turned back toward the Banat cabin with the man who had crossed 11 years and the full depth of a Canadian winter to find his way back to the girl he had pulled from the Saguenay, the summer she was 10 years old and the river didn't keep her.